So I think I need the mic. Just a little bit about City.AI. How it started was in 2017, two gentlemen in Holland started to look at how AI was applied in cities around the world. And based on that, they decided to also start a City.AI in Amsterdam, and there's three legs to it. There's the local quarterly gatherings. We'll be having ours in March, June, September, and November this year, and they happen in 50 cities around the world, 6 continents. So it's quite a huge global organization. There's an ecosystem mapping, which is very important. It maps not just the organizations and the tertiary institutions, but also the companies. And how we function is we, as ambassadors, meet quite regularly, and we speak to each other about what's going on in our cities in the hope that there's collaboration between organizations, institutions, and companies. And then the third is education, and that's going to take a lot longer because it happens with the mapping. So what education is required? Do we need to be training ML experts, or do we need to be talking to executives about what ML means? So like I said, it's over 50 cities now in 6 continents. The reason I became quite involved was when I looked at Africa, there were only 2 cities, Accra and Lagos, and there was nobody in the southern area of Africa. And because of how much footprint the organization City.AI, World Summit AI, and Inspired Minds have in Europe and the UN, I thought this was a really perfect way for us to get involved and have our voices heard. So the World Summit AI's first edition was the one I went to last year. They're having another one, and if you just go to worldsummit.ai, you'll get all the information you need from there. I definitely recommend it if you are in Holland around that time. They do put all of their talks on the YouTube channel quite regularly as it goes. And then tonight, so AI implications and impact is something very close to my heart. I probably am going to say something that gets everyone a little riled up, but I believe in regulation of technology. And I know, I'm so sorry, AJ. And so I wanted to put together a panel with Chris, who came on board as my ambassador, and I am incredibly grateful to. A panel of people who really understood what that meant and the implications of that. So I'm going to leave it to Chris to introduce the panel. After that, we're going to have a Q&A, and then we have an AI clinic. The AI clinic will develop over time, but loosely based around what are your challenges if you're working in machine learning and AI, and opening that up to the floor and seeing if there's specialists here who can help you. You have a 5-minute time span to present. Whatever your challenge is, if you wish to, or we can carry on in a Q&A. And then after that is structured networking. So that's peer-to-peer networking. We've created 4 topics, and if you walk through, there's snacks, there's soy juice, and there's some wine after the panel, and you can have a look at that. There's law in AI, AI in law, AI regulation, and AI in the African workplace. So I'm going to hand over to Chris. Thank you very much. So Chris is from Cape Town Intelligence Systems. Chris is from Cape Town Intelligence Systems, and I'm really grateful that he came on board. He's the machine learning AI specialist in the team. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Along with being part of the founding the meetup, I'm also doing a PhD in computational neuroscience. Basically, the bottom-up approach to understanding intelligence. I also apply AI in a number of spheres through business. I'm also an AI mentor through Udacity, which is a great place to learn online. I have the privilege of working with Neil du Toit as well at Q Division, but I'll introduce him. Stay. Cool. So the awesome panel we have for you today, I'm going to start with David Anderson. He's an IP lawyer, I believe. Do you want to come walk up, Salon? Part of what I do? Yeah, you can just do a very short intro.
Is this on? Yeah. I'm David Anderson. I'm an IT lawyer, but also specialize in intellectual property and, amongst other things, many niches. So I think what I bring to the table today is that what I've been doing for some time is to do legal compliance audits for systems for big online retailers, that type of thing, to advise them where the legal limits are of what they're doing. And obviously AI has been creeping into that space when it comes to personal information and that type of thing.
Next up, we have Lethabo, who is an amazing entrepreneur who's a co-founder and CEO, I believe, of M&W Innovation Studio. I'll let her introduce a little bit about her background.
Hi guys, I'm Lethabo. I'm the co-founder of M&W, like Chris said. I studied geomatics not many eons ago and immediately realized I'm not going to be working as a land surveyor, so I went straight into practicing design thinking and became a design thinker. What brings me here is because we realized that design thinking had its own flaws and faults, so we augmented our own design thinking system by building an AI on top of that. And yeah, just going to share what we learned. Didn't realize it, but geomatics is premised on the whole, I would never have said I studied AI until I actually went into building our own machine learning algorithm that I realized I was doing this my entire degree. It just wasn't called AI. But so, yeah, I'm very interested to share my insights with you.
Cool. Thank you. Next, we have Neil Toit, who is a data strategist at Q Division. And I've been friends with him since high school, so only a little bit of nepotism, but he would have made it on his own grounds regardless.
Hello. Oh, okay, cool. Hi, so I'm Neil. I made the weird decision of doing a degree in maths and then doing a degree in law, which I tried unsuccessfully to explain in a lot of interviews. Anyway, ended up being a data strategist. So yeah, at the moment, I'm at Q Division, digital products and services company. And I'm busy working on research tools to try and make law more accessible using machine learning and using AI. So I've got a very strong interest in the intersection of the law and of artificial intelligence. Always happy to chat about that.
Thanks. And the final panelist for today is Wiebke. She's doing a master's at UCT in AI, I believe.
Feels so strange standing when everyone else is sitting. Yeah, I'm working at UCT at the Energy Research Center as a data scientist, and when I started working there and started the journey into knowledge bases and databases, I realized that so much of knowledge representation and knowledge transfer that I was always really passionate about is housed in AI. So that's how I started doing a master's in computer science and AI. And so I'm really interested in looking where the logic-based and the data-based approaches of AI intersect. Yeah, and my personal fascination that I'm moving into now that I'm moving out of, slowly out of the master's, is sensor networks and the sensor web. And I'm busy building a startup company that looks at making data discoverable on the Internet of Things.
Awesome, thanks. And thank you everyone for attending. This is really happening because of you. What we're going to do is I'm going to be asking a few questions to the panel. They're going to give their opinion. I'm going to tell them why they're wrong. Kidding. And then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. So any thoughts or questions you have, just keep in mind until the end of the discussion. We'll put it forward there. And then Chantal mentioned the clinic. That's where there's a very specific challenge that gets focused. At the end, we're going to split into different groups to focus on certain topics. But I'll tell you which topics they are there. So thanks everyone for being here. Let's start with the interrogation, questions. So everyone gave a little bit of background as to how they got into AI. But we can start with anyone, maybe start with you, Wiebke, because you're right here. Why are you interested in AI? And what is the biggest change to our lives you think it will enable or cause?
The biggest change question is a hard one. So as I briefly explained, I didn't get into AI because of AI, I followed my interests and my passions, and they happened to be called AI. And so the actual story was one of me trying to figure out how to build a database, because that's what I was employed to do. And I came across an old little book written by a professor from UWC who I sent an email to, and he said, "Oh, I'm retired, but I'm coming to Cape Town from Wiebke Steel with my wife. Don't you want to come for tea?" So I went for this late night tea at 8 p.m. and he said, "You know, this work that I did was really exciting, but you should look at ontologies. They're way better." And so then the next day I went and I Googled ontologies and I was like, "Oh, look at that. That's AI." And so in that sense, I think what fascinates me about AI is the concept of machine representation and machine readability. So essentially what it means, if we look at the world becoming increasingly global and us working with a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, it's really difficult to figure out how we all going to understand each other. And I think one of the really great, maybe unintended and maybe often also neglected consequences of AI is that by making things machine readable, we're actually also making them human interoperable. So by being very explicit about what we mean and how we represent things is a way of making sure that as humans we can start understanding each other better. Yeah, and I mean, where it's going to be, I think it's going to be everywhere. So I think, yeah, it's hard to say even where we'll be within the next 5 years. I think AI is going to permeate every facet of our life.
So it's going to be a big change to everything. Okay. Lethabo, do you want to give your thoughts?
Yeah, I think my thoughts is, like you say, I just want to build on, it is everywhere because it's anywhere where anybody wants to do whatever they're doing better. It's not always, so when I particularly think about AI in the workplace or as an entrepreneur approaching businesses with, an AI solution like that, you've got a whole lot of skeptical managers like looking around like, how's this going to change how we do things? How's this going to? And I think it's true. Like we do need to look at it from like a dual mindset to say, if it's too good to be true, then maybe it is. But if look also, what does it have the potential to do? Whatever industry you're in, look at what your team is doing and how can you make their jobs better. Is there a workflow that it can improve what they do? Is there a system that we can add that it can improve what they do? So definitely in terms of making lives better, because it's assisting people do tasks that people could have never done before. And if we look at it that way, then definitely I do believe that it's a good and bright future ahead.
How did I get into AI? I originally was very skeptical of machine learning. I thought it was mostly for people who didn't really know how statistics worked. And then I saw Andrew's video of a helicopter flying itself, and I figured someone must know what they're doing if that's happening. But slightly more conceptual. I think what I came to realize is that in a lot of senses, machine learning is actually more falsifiable than traditional statistics insofar as it makes more predictions. So very often with statistical studies, you'll only ever realize they're wrong when you do a replication study down the line. But with machine learning, if a prediction is made and it doesn't happen, then you know your model's wrong. And so in that sense, it's almost more scientific, and I quite like that about it. So I was happy to get into that space. What do I think it's going to change? I'll say what isn't a great innovation with AI, or what I don't think it's all about, which is unlocking your phone a little bit faster with face recognition. I think there's a lot of much more exciting things we can do than just making lives a little bit more convenient in small ways, and that's what I hope we can chat about tonight as well.
I think for me, it started as a teenager reading Clarke and Asimov and just waiting for the world to catch up to what these guys have been theorizing, and which kind of naturally, when I studied law because I thought I'd be good at it, but I was always a bit of a geek and a techie at heart, so I just kind of veered towards IT law and systems auditing and that type of thing, and that's how I ended up doing what I do. And well, there's a lot of positivity coming from this side, so I might kind of take on the other side of the coin. I think AI is going to change the world in a significant way, and as a significant way as what industrial processes changed society. So I think the biggest impact will be on society. There will be positive impacts, but also negative impacts that we're going to have to manage and find solutions for. And I have a lot of conversations with people about this because we want to be positive about this because there are so many naysayers out there, but the responsible thing to do is to look at both the positive and the negatives and to figure out how are we going to mitigate this. So I think the social impact of machines doing what people do is going to be the biggest impact.
Cool, thanks. Well, related to that endpoint, I am going to talk about what Bill Gates has said, and he says that one of the greatest fears about AI is not what it will accomplish, but the speed at which jobs will be lost, and that we may not be able to compensate adequately to this job loss. Previously, you could do it happened over a while, so we can compensate by changing from manual to more thought type jobs. Now we can't really go much higher than a thought job. However, so he's saying there's going to be rapid job loss. Gardner predicts by 2020 that AI will have created more jobs than will have been lost. And so, question to the panel, maybe I'll start with you now, David, is what parts of our lives do you think are most at risk? Or perhaps the safest? And is there a safe zone, and what new jobs do you think will AI enable?
No? And just to qualify, I do believe that at least an equal amount of jobs will be created, but they will require different skill sets. So there will be jobs for different people. There will be people without jobs who can't do the new jobs. So I think obviously machine learning's perfect for repetition, perfect for doing the same thing quicker and quicker and quicker and smarter and smarter and smarter. So repetitive work, I think, will be what goes. And but I also believe that kind of artificial augmentation is going to be huge, because people want to protect our own interests. So we're going to go for the things that make us better before we go for the things that make us obsolete. So I think that's what's going to happen.
Just to add on that, I think in South Africa we've got a social responsibility, right? We've got majority of the population that just the AI is creating, certain types of jobs. The Accenture report recently released that you're going to have trainers, so people that teach AI what to do, and then people that validate and check that it's correct and it's true, and people that are going to be the in-betweeners. Sorry, I've given them random names, but the in-betweeners that connect those who research AI to the business world and sort of explain this black box that's happening. Because many people, a business says, I want to do this, and then you have this data scientist that says, this is the solution. And then what actually happened to get there is this black box that people are trying to understand, that's going to be a role. But those are such high-level roles that what happens to the rest of society? South Africa, already we have to, if we're going to benefit or build our economy, we have to play in the knowledge economy. And I think the role or responsibility that we're going to have to take, whether we leave it to the researchers advancing AI or to business world or to government, to say there are definitely going to be a whole lot of jobs that are replaced. In manufacturing, that's almost an obvious. Labor laws are so difficult that you'd rather use machines, right? And the topic, first started, years ago with 3D printing. People were so scared, oh my gosh, 3D printing is going to replace jobs. There's always going to be a new technology that's going to replace jobs. But I think what our responsibility is to do is to figure out what can or people that, as long as we're going to have a large majority of low-skilled individuals, what role do they play in AI? Is it in, checking speech-to-text algorithms? How correct are they? Is it in checking, just the output of something? Maybe validating, imagery classification, things like that. That everyday people without a high level of education can learn to do. Then we're building an inclusive system, and we're not worried about the exclusion that, or the jobs that AI will start consuming.
I'm just going to reply directly to that, and we'll ask a further question directly to that. So at the deep learning in Lethabo, which was fantastic, one of the suggestions from the audience that maybe Africa's role is purely to label data. However, do you think that could set a false precedent to be like, if you want data labeled, take it to Africa, but if you want a good algorithm, take it elsewhere? Do you think that that precedent, when enabling low-skilled people, could actually hinder the other progress from more high-level?
I don't know. It's all about I would stress that right now our focus is the creation of jobs, but 2 days ago, not really, a week ago, a few days ago, I was at a talk with the chief marketing officer of Google. He's a South African guy, like the Africa part, and I was asking, like, is your algorithm ever, the speech-to-text, ever going to consider, African languages or, the likes? Because, and he's like, it's not a big enough business need, right? It's not a big enough business need for them to focus on dialects, which Africa has hundreds of, if not thousands of. So if Africans were going to focus on building really good voice analytics, it should come from here, because if we can pick up 1,000 dialects, it will work everywhere else in the world, right? So we're using our data to be able to classify things that, if you go to Europe, let me not use Europe, let me use America, you probably have like a few different dialects or, accents of English that it will definitely work. If it works here, it should work everywhere else in the world. So the question is, we're really trying a lot with their speech-to-text algorithm, and we're trying to train it, and he was like, you guys, or we, have to now figure out gather our own data, do all of that, but then what's to stop us from actually building a better system as far as we can? So in collecting the data, you build data around, in collecting data, you build algorithms around stronger data, which then, what's to stop you from Googling how to, and then learning from the rest of the world what they've done, and then adding onto it as to what we can do better.
Cool, thanks. Neil, Wiebke, do you want to?
Yeah, can I just add, comment on that? I know there are attempts at the moment to try and, for example, create natural language processing algorithms for African languages that don't require labeling. And I think that's a trend in a lot of things as well. As my concern with labeling data as a job is that supervised algorithms, I don't think, are going to be the powerhouse of machine learning for that long. The unsupervised algorithms are going to start to do better, and then you don't require that anymore. So that's my one concern with that. I think another thing that's just worth pointing out with the low skill, high skill dichotomy is that even at the lower end, the level of skill required increases. So nowadays, for example, if you run a backpackers and you don't know how Google Analytics works, then the backpackers down the road, where the owner does know how Google Analytics works, is going to do better. And that's increasingly happening, and there's a point at which you can't just educate everyone to move them up, and there are some people who aren't going to have that level of education, where previously accessible jobs are now inaccessible to them, even if they aren't rendered obsolete by AI. So that's also something to watch out for. I definitely think there's going to be major job loss, and I think we need to be honest about it.
So to me, the question of job losses, while it's important, I think it's quite shallow in the sense that it really just scratches the surface of where the impact is going to be. And so from two levels. The one is that I think if we think of what humans should do, we should move away from just thinking jobs and thinking thriving, and saying, how do we create a world in which humans can thrive? And boring data labeling jobs don't really allow humans to be the best version of themselves. So that's the one. The other is really saying, where does the real risk lie? And where does the real risk lie? And actually even more so saying it's less about job losses than about perpetuating inequality to an extent where it actually becomes so deep that once you're on the wrong end of the track, you have no way of getting out of there again. And so the problem lies with a company like Facebook paying something like $8,000 in tax in the UK in 2016, 2017, which is a massive issue. There's another issue of saying once AI starts doing work of humans, you lose the tax revenue of all those people who would have done that work. What do you do with that shortfall? And so I think there's really a question about regulation policy on the one hand, but also about taxation on the other hand. And I think we'd probably do better if we moved away from a conversation around jobs and start focusing instead on a conversation of inequality.
Awesome. Talking about inequality, there are well-known initiatives such as OpenAI saying like everyone should have access to these tools to test it in a standard way. But what it also means is that plenty of people now have access to something that they could use potentially unethically. Should AI be freely accessible to be used by anyone potentially for unethical reasons? Should it be like stringently regulated? And will those like already advanced countries have an even bigger advantage if you democratize this AI, or should it only be in like a few small hands? Whoever wants to chime in first, go ahead.
Well, there are two issues. You were kind of talking about society, kind of a micro society, and kind of geopolitical issues when it comes to that. But you know, I think one of, and we're probably going to still talk about this, but one of the arguments for regulation is exactly inclusivity. You know, to deal with inequalities when it comes to, as you were saying, urban planning, for instance. If there's kind of algorithm that helps that can help you create a suburb that is just amazing to live in and that is just great, that should be used not only in affluent areas, that should be used in less affluent areas. And unfortunately, as we can see from history, you have to force people. There has to be some, even if it's just light or even self-regulation, there needs to be some obligation to use this new revolution that we're seeing in everyone's benefit, because we can see from the past what happens when, you know, the free market just has its way. So I think kind of from a micro level, there's the equity thing. Then from the geopolitical perspective, you know, it's a very interesting question. I keep on, whenever I read something by an American commentator, they're saying, don't regulate because we're going to lose the arm race against China and this and that. You know, they're really fearing that regulation or intervention is going to hold particular nations as economic powerhouses back, and for others to win. So that is a conundrum that we're going to have to solve, because the moment we're talking about kind of military issues, military conflicts, and so forth, you know, it'll trump the greater good argument. So I think that's something that we're going to have to grapple with still.
So I find the question of OpenAI interesting because it's mostly actually a question about data and business model to me, more than about openness of algorithms. And so essentially, to make any of the algorithms, the deep learning algorithms work, you need a lot of data. So the amount of companies that can actually use them productively in their business environments are a handful. It's Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple, and probably another 5 or 6, like a couple of Chinese ones. And so in that sense, they're actually, like, so by making all the algorithms open, you get the benefit of having the whole world help you develop your algorithms and your tools, but ultimately no one can use them except for you, because you're the only ones that have access to the data. And so to me, you can't speak about OpenAI without also speaking about data privacy and data ownership. So it's only when we start taking data ownership seriously, and as individuals we start claiming a right to our data, that we can really start speaking about democratizing AI, so to say.
It's data and hardware of the big requirement.
Lethabo, Neil, do you have anything else?
That was my contribution. No, it's hardware as well. I mean, if you want to run big neural networks, then you need the data first. I mean, I know IBM, just for medical data, for example, has spent, I think, somewhere in the region of $1 billion. So, I mean, certainly in that regard, I mean, just maybe tying in with the previous chat about ways of making money in the new economy. At the moment, most of your data, the people who earn money for it are intermediaries. So your click streams like Facebook, Google, and your medical data like medical aids, sell that to IBM. I think we now have the technology to move it to where you can sell your own clickstream data and you can sell your own medical data and get paid for that directly, which will be better. So that's on the data side. On the hardware side, I mean, you need GPUs or some other form of these new tensor modules that are being used. So, I mean, there, fortunately, Amazon is being quite nice, and they are giving discounts to students and people who need it. But that's certainly a bottleneck, and yeah, part of overcoming that will be looking at decentralized hardware, being able to use clusters more easily and stuff, so that people can get together and maybe have enough compute power to run an algorithm.
Just to add on that, like I do agree with, you know, open algorithms versus open data, but the regulation around what people are actually going to use that data for. So only institutions or you know, public data, yes, make sure governments make data accessible to, you know, developers or people who are trying to build systems. But what are people using that data for? That's the challenge. If you're going to be building an open system, the chances are you're going to be building it for your own profit or for your own benefit, which is why it makes sense why Facebook, Apple, all of those are, you know, keeping the data to themselves, because that's where the money is. And even anyone now trying to like ask governments or whoever, please give us access to your data. What are we going to be using it for? And are we really going to be using it for the benefit of society, or are we going to be using it to sell it on based on what we've created? So it becomes like a difficult thing. Do we pay? If we ask for the data to be open and to be, you know, accessible, should we pay for it? Should it be free? And
so I just want to make a distinction between open data and data ownership. So I don't think all data should be open, not at all. But I think as individuals, we ought to have a right to own our data. And so, for example, there's a startup that just came out in the US now called Shoppin, and they allow you as an individual, for example, to own all your e-commerce shopping data. And so essentially what it means that if somebody, instead of Amazon getting your data and everybody else either having to get it from Amazon or not being able to enter the market because Amazon has it, it means you as an individual can now make your data available, and you can get paid in return for making your data available for marketing. So that's more that direction that.
Awesome, some really great points. I'm just going to make a few notes and then move on to the next question. Again, hardware is very important, and Google has one up to Amazon and said, researchers, if you want to use deep learning, we have a TPU, tensor processing unit, cloud freely available. But again, it's in an organization that's fairly centralized now. There's also GPUs are becoming more expensive thanks to blockchain, which ironically a whole bunch of these blockchain initiatives are to try to democratize AI a little bit more. The final thing I just wanted to mention is that while absolutely large amounts of training data may be necessary, initially a large amount of transfer learning is very powerful. So something trained on medical images for the lungs can be transcribed to the heart, for example. And that's, you need significantly fewer images. So there's a whole bunch of interesting questions as well there, where it was trained on something else, and whether it, and how well it works on the next one, and whether you should like attribute the initial data as well. But talking about this data, there's a lot of these algorithms require training, especially in supervised form, and a lot of the data that's used has bias. Okay, so what concerns are there now for bias in data, and what steps can be done for there to be less?
I don't mind starting on this one. Yeah, so this is where maybe also Dave will jump in, because it's more on the law side as well. But The Promotion of Equality and Protection of Unfair Discrimination Act is quite interesting in this regard because they define something called indirect discrimination, which is where you do just discriminate based on a correlate. So if you implement a policy in one town, for example, and not in another town, and there happen to be more white people in the one town, more black people in the other town, there's a prima facie case of indirect discrimination there, even if the policy on the face of it has got nothing to do with race. So that presents a challenge for people implementing machine learning because if you implement an algorithm and the results that come out are in any way correlated with any of the prohibited grounds of discrimination, then on the face of it, there's an assumption that's indirect discrimination, and burden of proof shifts to you to prove that it was legitimate, that was coincidence, and that there was a good reason why it happened that way. So it presents a problem in the first place because just a correlation, which is easy to check, is enough to found a claim there. But I think it also presents a very easy test, which is that you can literally just build up test cases that run every time you deploy a model that check them for correlations against all the listed grounds and anything else that could potentially be a problem. And if it comes back with one, then it raises a warning and you know about it, and you've got to investigate why that happened and see whether your data is biased. Especially if you're doing supervised, it's very easy to check this and look into it. So it's very easy to build test cases, which is something that machine learning practitioners don't really do because there aren't really standards. But if there are going to be standards for testing your algorithms for problems, that would be the first one I would do.
Just to add to that is that the Protection of Personal Information Act takes that even further and expressly prohibits bias. So it requires your data to be of a certain quality, and that includes data that's not biased. And you must actively, in terms of this act, effectively audit your data to make sure that it does not unfairly discriminate on grounds of race, sex, gender, etc. Essentially the kind of the constitutional grounds of that's going to be once it's fully enacted and so forth. It's something that I already do for clients, is to effectively is for them to explain how decisions are made, what's used to make decisions, and then to audit that against your obligations when it comes to, say, for instance, personal information. And it takes a long time, and I think with time we'll find ways to audit that properly internally, but I find that the data scientists are still kind of not taking it seriously at this point, or hating the fact that they have to kind of jump through this hoop now because it effectively makes their algorithm less effective when they have to cut this and this and this and this out of the mix, and not be able to take that into account.
I think I'm going to speak on a more philosophical level. I don't see how we can remove bias from AI on a high level that, like Einstein says, we can't fix problems with the same type of thinking we went into them. We as people, we're biased. We've got prejudice. We've got all sorts of issues, as a human race. So, and if we're using AI to make what we do better and faster, we're actually speeding up the rate at which our own bias and prejudice have created the world that we live in. So our algorithms only, perpetuate our thinking. So unless we completely think about it from a whole new, paradigm, this is almost becoming existential here. But what are we using the algorithms, what are we using the technology for, and how can we, sitting in our, high-rise building, make sure that we're building technology that's inclusive for all, that's really going to remove bias. You don't know how what I'm creating is going to impact the next city if I don't go to that next city, figure out what the problems are, what the needs are. Otherwise, you're creating something that fits perfectly in your little utopia, and then you go to the, the next city and you figure out you've created something completely, rogue. That's why I suppose, why I think like this is because I'm a design thinker. We know that you can't come up with great ideas sitting behind your desk. You actually have to go out and empathize with people, understand who they are, understand that what you're doing, you're the expert at the actual technology, you're the expert at the solution, but people are the expert in terms of they know what they need. So if you go and you start understanding people, start understanding what are the things that have created the divisions in society, what are the things that have created the complete stuff-ups in society, and how can we make sure that the systems we create don't perpetuate that mess, and then only then, after understanding that, build the technology to fix that.
I do think that, obviously we need to make better systems, but the data is still the issue, and it's almost like we need fresh database, because whenever we look at historical data, you've got algorithms, for instance, in the States, where they use algorithms partly to decide whether to release someone on parole. And there was clear racial bias in three of the 5 systems. Clear racial bias, and it wasn't that the machine has prejudice against people of color. It's just that the data that was fed into the system was biased. So there, absolutely, we are all biased, but there are certain massive issues that we have to deal with first when it comes to credit worthiness, the statistical, historical likelihood of someone being a criminal, that type of thing. Those data sets are highly problematic, and we have to, there are definitely certain data sets that we can focus on first, and then, there are certain less consequential biases that we don't have to fix immediately, but there are certain that we have to fix now before we go on.
I'm just going to say one thing very quickly and then let you continue. And there's one of my favorite graphs is basically the likelihood of someone being given parole, and the likelihood decreased the closer to lunch it got for the judge. So there's also human bias as well. So, but we're not going to correct all bias. Not trying to say that.
So I think it's important to recognize that the world that we come from, or the systems that have been designed, have deeply prejudiced against everybody who isn't a white male. And so considering that we're using historic data to train models of the future, if we use those data sets that describe the past, I think we're in deep trouble. And so criminal data set is one. Let's take home loans as another one. So in many countries, women weren't allowed to vote till the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. If we take data sets of home ownership, I'd be really curious to know whether, how many women have bought houses, and based on that, how likely are women to pay back their loans on time? I don't know. It might mean that women are less likely to pay them back, so you get higher premiums, just as a very random example that's maybe less infringing. But there are also other cases of the US police force, for example. There's a company, Palantir, that supplies the US police force with crime prediction statistics, so places where future crime is going to happen. And that starts becoming really, really scary when you start saying, now you're actually acting to prevent a crime based on some prediction on some data set. And it hasn't happened yet. And so I think we should be careful of using any data from the past if it hasn't been very, very carefully scrutinized.
All excellent points, thank you. Moving on to the concept of black boxes, which is, everyone's heard neural networks are a black box. So the leaders in deep learning, spoken to like Yoshi Bengio, Jan LeCun, Greg Corrado, Tim Lillicrap, I'm like, do you consider these black boxes? And they outright say no, except for like very fringe like edge research cases. So nothing in application at the moment they consider black boxes. But many in the public, many people who apply these systems do consider them as such. So why do you think there's such a discrepancy? Is there like a Dunning-Kruger effect where the experts, they understand it all, or they just think they understand it all? Is there ignorance or apathy from people implementing these things? Are we applying a criteria too strict on these algorithms when we consider that we don't know how we think? we are quite human biased in that regard, because I don't understand my actions and decisions most of the time. There's still debate in psychology whether you form an attitude based on behaviors or behaviors based on an attitude. So yeah, black boxes. Do you think they're black boxes? Why do you think experts don't?
I just have a very quick comment. So my car can be a black box to me, but not to my mechanic. And I think it's the same with AI algorithms. If somebody has spent 30 years developing neural networks, I'm pretty sure it's not much of a black box to them because they really understand how to tune each component of it. But yeah, someone else it might be.
If I can just mention from a legal perspective, what we're seeing happening is the idea of explainability, and I think you have to pull that a little bit down to like the common denominator, so that people who are not experts, if I think the benchmark that they're kind of looking at in the EU and so forth is, can you explain it to a lay person? Can you, if a machine made this decision, can you explain how it made the decision and what it took into account? Because that's what we expect of people too, legally, if we're looking at claims and so forth, and we're looking at negligence and intent. We're looking at reasonably, at which considerations were taken into account, which reasonably foreseeable things were excluded and so forth. So if the concept of explainability, I think, does mean that your mechanic should be able to tell you how the basics work, or else they can't invoice you for that. If they can't explain to you what they changed in your engine, they shouldn't be invoicing you for that.
Yeah, the question is just who you're explaining it to. Yeah, I read definition of AI that I think sums up for me what this whole debate is about, which is, as soon as you know what it does, it's not called AI anymore, it's called software. Expert systems were AI, 40 years ago? You put a bunch of if statements in your code and it's AI. So will there always be AI that we can't explain? I think yes. Maybe we'll figure out how to explain the neural networks we've got at the moment, but then we'll invent a new one that we can't, and that will be the AI. So we have to come to terms with having black box AI, even if we are working towards explaining what we currently use. And then the question is just who you're explaining it to. So obviously, if you're explaining it to a lawyer, there's quite stringent requirements. I think in the protection in Poppy now, there's kind of like there's a ban on automated decision making, and then some exceptions. But like the point of departure is you can't do it.
You need to be able to explain it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so obviously there it's different criteria. I know there's a couple of things as well where if someone makes a decision, they need to have applied their mind, and I don't think an AI would ever pass that test. If you are in my position, where very often you have to explain these things to business people, then that's another thing altogether. But I've certainly seen a lot of cases, I mean, not even AI, just like actuarial models where they're clearly working out the right thing, and it's very complex, and they're accounting for all the variables. But the person who's supposed to use that result and make a decision based off it doesn't understand it. And so they ignore it when they make their decision, even though it is the right metric to be using. And with machine learning, I mean, people say to me, for example, why should you look at decision trees if you can just use neural networks for most things? It's like, well, because people understand how a decision tree works. And you can explain it to a business person and say, this is how it's coming up with this answer, and then they might use that result in decision making. So whether it's a black box or not really just, to me, is dependent on, well, who needs to understand it.
I also think AI to me is a much wider definition than just machine learning and deep learning. And I think expert systems in many ways are still really relevant. And ultimately, to me, artificial intelligence is any decision-making process that can be automated and done by a machine, to me, falls within that scope. And there are a lot of AI and even machine learning techniques that are actually explainable. So thinking Bayesian networks, for example, are a really great graphical view of seeing how cause-effect relationships can be mapped out. And if we look at all of the Internet 2.0 or the semantic web that's being created, is all about knowledge. It's about annotating data with metadata so that you can understand what the data represents. And so even if you search, for example, for something like Eiffel Tower on Google now, and Google gives you the height of the Eiffel Tower and links you to different pages, etc., a lot of that is based on knowledge representation, not on data-driven techniques. So I think it's also important that we don't focus only on deep learning and machine learning, but that we start really saying, how do we integrate different AI fields and different AI technologies to move forward?
From a business perspective, it's definitely, a gimmicky tool if you can't explain what the output was. You're meant to be using it to sort of justify decisions. You're meant to be using it to, improve decisions. And if you can't explain the output, or you don't know why, it made that choice, then I don't think you should be using that tool. But you're right again. That was just my 2-cent comment to add there. But it definitely does depend on who you're explaining it to and why. When we were explaining our one algorithm, it was purely because AI is natural language processing is such a new thing for them that they wanted to understand why does it do what it's doing, right? And then it was going all the way down to the statistics and all of that to explain purely for educational purposes. But then the output, to understand why did it do that, that's because that's the input that went in. And then, there's the difference in having to explain and understanding what it did to get to where it came from. But also if you're going to use it for a business decision, you cannot just accept that what's happening behind that neural net was created by some expert 30 years ago, therefore it needs to work for me today. It's not a good enough justification.
No, thanks. Very, very good points. Some people also think that older AI tools may be more explainable just because they've been around longer, so we have more understanding of what they're doing. Just a thought there. Some dealing with banks as well, they're often like, yes, we want to use neural networks, but we don't know how they work, so we can't use them. Literally, that's what they've said. There's some one of the best researchers in something called biplots, which is PCA and way better. The expert is at UCT, so they're really like these cutting-edge tools, but a lot of them either aren't known or are very advanced to use. Other ways to think about is a functional outcome or a mathematical outcome. You can know exactly what the weights are in the network, so how everything's summed together to get your final result. But ultimately, most of the time, you care about the functional outcome more than you do about the mathematical one. So there's also differences there about explainability, but all very important things to consider. I'm sure we'll have a longer talk there. To be more relevant to Africa as well, question obviously to everyone is, how can African AI practitioners and researchers play a role in shaping global AI?
The data, like you said, we have to take it upon ourselves to collect our own data. Otherwise, Africa remains that poor dark continent with no information or anything. We can't create systems that will teach us how to, invest in people and businesses and in technology if we don't take it upon ourselves to collect our own data, which has been very much proved by, even Google themselves, that it's not a big enough market, and we have to prove that wrong. There are so many people here, and there's so much opportunity, but we can't wait. There's no one who's going to collect that data for us, and if we're going to advance in AI and all of that, we actually have to take a few steps back into saying, what information do we need to make it possible?
I think an opportunity is the social divides that we see in Africa, the difference between the haves and the have-nots, something that is not such a big issue in Europe or in America. It exists, but not as it exists in Africa. So I think African developers will be inclined to bring a kind of a social justice angle into it, because it's we all live in Africa, and it's right there for us to notice all the time. So I think subconsciously, an African developer will probably be more likely to take a just transition and social justice into account when creating systems or creating solutions.
Toussaint? Yeah, cool. Don't have that strong of an opinion about this question. I think it's very much an open topic, and love to chat to people later about it. But just some top line thoughts. I think the first one is that we aren't necessarily as far behind with all aspects of data as we think. So, I mean, we're definitely behind in things like clickstream data. But it's actually, it's a low-hanging fruit. If you look even in the first world, engagement with social media versus engagement with the TV, you're going to find it's higher with the TV. That's definitely the case in the developing world. So, I mean, those sorts of things, it's still green fields, anyone's game to get in there and start looking at collecting most of the data which is relevant that hasn't been collected yet. We're going to lose if we start going after images and start going after English text and going after clickstream. But there's a lot more interesting stuff. The second thing I would say is, and this is also just a bit of a thought, but the biggest innovations in statistics were around accounting for small amounts of data. Usually in cases where, like, for example, if you're testing a bullet, then to test the bullet you have to fire it, and then you lose the bullet. So you really want to have as small a sample as you possibly can, and that's where things like the student t-distribution come in, which are really the big innovations in stats. And I think that we might be in a position where we are pushed to come up with similar innovations in machine learning that allow us to produce the same thing without having billions and billions of records.
Wiebke, you good? Okay. We're going to have one final question, and it's more of a pie in the sky one. So, has anyone heard of Elon Musk's Neuralink? Okay, so his concept is pretty much that humans are going to become the limbic system for AI. We're going to be the emotion and the ethics, and AI is going to be physically attached to us, and that will do all the rational thinking, all the logical thinking. Obviously very extreme. So the question to the panel is, how do you see humans and AI coexisting, or not coexisting, maybe there's a war, in 5, 10, 20 years? Will we work for an AI? How will AI have ethics? Will it have our own? How will we train it? Just the like general ethical augmentation question.
Yeah, I think humans have self-interest, first and foremost. So, as I said earlier, I think we'll go for augmentation first. But I can see if you look at the volumes of people taking Ritalin, Xanax, that type of thing, some things that enhance or somehow augment people's performance. I think as soon as it's possible, people are going to use AI to augment their abilities physically and intellectually. I think people will do it as soon as it's possible. So I think Elon Musk is right on the money. Human nature will take us there.
So you might have a stronger opinion on this than me, but not a stronger opinion, you might be able to refute it. But I think the human brain is still the most marvelous computer that exists, and I think we haven't even started scratching the surface of what our brains are capable of doing. And I think throughout the past millennia, there have been individuals that have really mastered their brains and have really achieved truly phenomenal things. And while I won't say that humans will be able to do the data processing that machines can do, and I think that's exactly why we need AI, that AI can do those kind of tasks, I think we are yet to discover what our brains can truly do. And I think that's something that all humans should aspire to get to understand their brain a little bit better. And if I think of terms like general AI, so basically replicating human intelligence, I think that it's possible potentially, but I think also it's much more likely to evolve in space than on Earth. Like, I don't really see the need for it on Earth.
Sorry, I don't know, this thing keeps changing. This one I don't think we can discuss by just talking about AI. And yeah, this is something I thought would come up earlier, but we've got AI and we've got blockchain and we've got IoT, which means that if all those things pan out well, what you're going to very soon have is AI that is capable of owning assets, capable of contracting with smart contracts, and capable of existing independently from humans. So when we think about AI at the moment, we always think of it as tied to a human, like this is my AI car, or this is my AI virtual assistant. When you have an AI that can exist on its own in the internet, potentially in a way that no one can touch it, that can own an estate and that can contract, and that can manage its own affairs, there's a whole world of possibilities there for what human and AI engagement is potentially going to end up like. I mean, you can have AIs running their own businesses, and yeah, if you're a creative person more than me, you can think of some potential scenarios.
Disaster planning, for us to create systems like that that are so smart, we should probably start thinking about, you know, what happens in a world where we're no longer necessary. Therefore, you know, how are we going to regulate to prevent that from happening? Or how are we going to create a world where we can coexist with AI? Because the fear is once that happens, we can't coexist in that environment. But I definitely think it's inevitable. So we must start disaster planning or thinking about how we're going to coexist in a world where we're no longer necessary or as necessary as we thought we were.
That's some very good points. And with that, I'm going to open up to the audience for questions to see how many people ask how long until AI takes over the world. Should we have a roaming mic or?
Hello, 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 hi. So you guys have touched a lot on how AI can affect business and decision making and that sort of thing. But one thing that I always sort of find interesting and something that's not talked about a lot is what are the potential effects that AI could have on our very own systems of governance? Like how could AI affect how we draw voting districts, how we choose new systems of elections, these sort of things which, you know, we all complain about how bureaucracy is so slow, and so, you know, it would be a natural thing that we would desire to apply AI to these sort of very slow systems. And how would this sort of, you know, change the way that our own government works?
So I like that question. Thanks for the question. Because I think that's been a trend. So one of the kind of the themes I've seen with technology, or that I would like to view technology through, is the everyone can be X theme. So kind of if you look at Twitter, in a sense, it's almost like now everyone can be a journalist, their own journalist. If you happen to be at the site where something interesting is happening, you don't have to belong to Reuters anymore to do that. If you look at Bitcoin, it's everyone can be their own bank. So firstly, you own your own money now, you own the private keys, it's yours. And secondly, you have a push mechanism. So with a bank, you usually give a shop permission to pull from your account. With Bitcoin, it's a push mechanism. So in a sense, it's everyone has their own banking infrastructure. And with law and AI, which is where I think it's interesting as well, because that's definitely a state function, I think that one of the very interesting applications is going to be people looking for alternative dispute resolution. And looking away from the courts and state infrastructure to try and handle their disputes. And that's going to be a removal of government function into a decentralized space. And I think, yeah, it's going to be possible to resolve disputes very cheaply with AI adjudication, and that a lot of people will opt into that. And generally the trend with all of those sort of technologies is taking a centralized function and saying now everyone can do it. Very often with distributed systems, and I think we've seen that with news and with banking, and I think we're going to see it with law quite soon, where people don't just rely on courts, but they can start relying on smart contracts and potentially AI adjudicators as well to resolve disputes.
On another tip, you were talking about improving governance systems or voting systems and so forth. So I think where AI is quite useful is that it's a sophisticated, objective system. And when it comes to, say, improving governance systems, you can use AI to take the politics out of it and say to them, here's your politics, but here's the best way to do it. So if you want to differ with this, if you want to differ with the best way to govern this or to deal with this, then it's your politics coming into play. So I think it's an extremely useful tool, the fact that it's so objective and free of politics, granted your data set's not biased to a certain disposition.
I was just going to say, otherwise the cynical view is if politics is an AI and you've got Facebook and social media dominating the space and you get Cambridge Analytica coming in, then you end up with a very different world of Brexit and Trump. So.
I'm just going to say one final thing on that, and that is often a barrier to AI is humans. So while AI may form a better system, it's the people currently in charge being able to accept that as better.
Okay, is it working? Yep. Okay, so we've talked about digital divides, etc. So if we look at AI, the Watson AI API does about 30 to 40,000 transactions to solve a language question. That's quite a lot of energy. Blockchain or Bitcoin uses half the power of Kuberg to do 12 transactions every 7 seconds. So who's going to afford the scalability? I mean, do we need to be on the planet, or are we just going to fill ourselves with carbon dioxide and die? How are we going to solve this? No, just genuinely, because everything we've seen so far in knowledge automation has been profoundly and extremely expensive in terms of energy and actually cannot scale. Well, not if we can live in the world. How are we going to deal with that?
I think someone wants to go first. Cool. I find often humans, we will solve a problem first and then find the efficient way to do it second. And you can think about plastic as an example, right? So it solves a problem first, then let's figure out how to recycle it, okay? So recent advances relating to blockchain and GPUs for training. So some blockchains now, they have different mechanisms to prove that something is accurate, that doesn't require the same energy consumption as Bitcoin does, and some really, really advanced mechanisms there, proof of stake, distributed proof of stake. It's a mechanism, regardless of what you think of that cryptocurrency, has a very good mechanism for building consensus with a very low energy consumption. In terms of deep learning, we're moving away from GPUs to TPUs, which are tensors, and they're just way more efficient at doing the types of operations that neural networks need to do. So as you become more specialized, we can use those sorts of technologies that are focused on that. The final point would be, do you get neural engineering architectures where they're building hardware that is highly distributed to try compete with the way brains often compute things in highly parallel fashion. And already the state of the art is, while like 10 to 100 times less energy efficient than the brain, is still 1,000 times more efficient than an equivalent GPU or CPU.
Just on that, I think hindsight is always clearer than foresight, right? There's so many, excuse my language, fuck-ups that we've created as society. And when in the name of science or in the name of advancement, we didn't care to look at the impact that it had. I think that book by Bill Bryanson, a brief history of everything, nearly everything, and looking at what, corporations particularly and governments did when they discovered lead, they put it in everything, absolutely everything, toothpaste, everything. And the moment they realized that it's actually super, super harmful, they hid that fact from society because it's really cool, it's a cheap metal, it's all of that. And I think that unless, I think that we're going to keep doing that with all the new technologies that we try to create, because for the sake of perpetuating, and that's why we fight regulation, because fighting regulate or adding or putting regulation means we're not going to advance as fast. But if we look at it, it was only in the 1980s, I think, that CFCs in the atmospheres were banned. But before that, it was absolutely like a ramp. Every single thing had CFC, and the first scientist that discovered that this is a huge problem was shut up. Like, you have to keep quiet because we need to progress. And when it comes to this, when it comes to the environment, you're going to get a whole lot of advocates for AI and all of that to say that how could we stop this great progression in mankind for the sake of saving, the trees or saving this. And I think we're just it's been happening for hundreds of years. That's how we are as society, which is why I really do advocate for a different way of thinking, because I don't see how anyone is going to stop the progression of technology for saving the environment. I guess we're all going to put our faith in Elon Musk and move to Mars.
So I think there's a huge opportunity in renewable energy because it allows the data companies, the tech companies, to own the infrastructure because it's localized and it relies on resources that are renewable, that you don't have to mine at a social and economic expense, and that you can and that's very malleable and flexible. So I think you will, Tesla kind of jumped on that bandwagon because I think they saw that the first barrier that we're going to hit is an energy barrier. So we're going to need an alternative way because we can't do it with coal-fired power station, and nuclear is just too expensive. Then there's the cost issue. So I think renewable energy where it is now cheaper than nuclear and coal. Doesn't matter what Eskom tries to tell you, it is in fact cheaper than coal and nuclear, and it's localized. It's flexible. So the tech companies are going to take that and they're going to power themselves. So I think we might not have such a big energy issue because we have almost unlimited natural resources from which to pull.
Cool. That's also a very interesting question, I think, particularly because those two examples are very different. With AI, we're trying to make the machines as efficient as possible to get the work done really quickly, and we just can't because the problems are really hard. With blockchain, we purposefully make it very difficult so that you can't trick the network, and the problems get more difficult all the time. Chris and I disagree very strongly on the appropriate scaling solution. I think IOTA is an expensive database. But yeah, I'm in favor of the Lightning Network, which doesn't have to broadcast nearly as many transactions, so that it actually handles them at a much lower power. Yeah, I'm not an energy expert, so I won't comment on that, but I'll just say tech's done a lot of good as well in that regard. I don't know what the balance is. Maybe on net it's been worse, but something like online news has been massively positive for the environment. So.
Hi. I'm not really asking a question, but more weighing in a sense. And it's kind of touching on what Wiebke was saying earlier, is a lot of the issues we've been looking at tonight have been looked at quite strictly a machine learning approach, whereas AI is a much more integrative approach. And I think a lot of the solutions to these problems lie in a more integrative intelligent system. For example, specifically like in the law case, something like a knowledge representation and reasoning approach is a lot more appropriate because it's a very clearly defined structure. You've got the laws in place, and instead of a bottom-up approach where you're learning, you've got the laws clearly defined. So you define an ontology with all your laws, and then you have reasoning process through that. That's far more efficient, and no learning's really involved, and it's a very objective system that if it's defined with the laws and you've got all your clashes sorted out, and that's their projects are currently being that's being worked on. I know specifically in the EU they've got a big project working on that, and I think that's going to be our solution. Also in terms of energy, for example, yes, it's very inefficient and energy intensive to do a lot of learning all the time, but once those things are learned, you can populate an ontology, and you've got now a system in place where you don't have to go relearn all these facts. So it's not like a huge pile of energy that's always being used on that. And also one more thing that I can touch on is also speaking about biases earlier in the data. If you've got domain experts modeling environments that they know about, that they can specifically be aware of biases and try to eliminate that. So you've got someone in a specific area, you go to someone, a local in the area, get their knowledge, to take them as domain expert and model that, then we're solving a lot of solutions. And I think the future in AI, a lot of the work is going to be in integrating all these approaches and creating a more wholesome system rather than just I think machine learning, because it's been easily applicable to commerce and industry, that a lot of the focus has been on that and not on other elements of AI that need to start being integrated. So yeah, I just think that should be kept in mind.
Cool. I completely agree. I think integrating symbolic AI, so all the planning algorithms, for example, we use knowledge bases, and statistical AI, is very important. And I think a large reason why we've been focusing on that recently is because it's been really good at a lot of things, that people just run with it, and then now we're starting to hit a few walls and be like, okay, we can actually need significantly less data if we integrate symbolic AI as well. Fortunately, there are people doing it, but I think more definitely needs to happen. I completely agree with you.
Okay, cool. Neil, I really liked your comment about encouraging test-driven development and machine learning. Do you think that this could be standardized, and do you perhaps think that this is the primary way that AI could be regulated? Anybody so welcome to answer.
I'll give a brief answer. Thanks for the question. I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I 100% have the answer, though. It's tricky because a lot of AI is open source and a lot of it is not formalized, and no one who's an AI practitioner is part of a regulatory body. So things like those sort of practices, but I guess it's similar for a lot of development as well, and they've managed to do it just through practices becoming ingrained over time. So I'm sure that certain best practices will become ingrained over time, and I hope that doing some QA, not just on the commercial value of your algorithm, but the ethical and the compliance value as well, does become ingrained over time. But I can't see a short-term, quick fix way that can just be implemented.
Fortunately, OpenAI does have an OpenAI gym that you can test certain algorithms on, and makes it easy to integrate as well. So you can have a few games that they automatically make accessible for your system instead of you starting from scratch. So there are these initiatives that are starting to do some sort of standardization for AI. Especially anyone who's done like a competition and they forgot to set their random seed for their AI algorithm, and you try to replicate it, and it doesn't perform as well as you said, there are certain things that should be in standardized format as well. So it's a very good point. It needs to have more.
If AI is making everything more efficient, what do you think the chances are that on average everyone works X amount of time a week? Would that come down over time maybe if everything's more efficient? Would we get more leisure time on average?
You can have your holidays. So the conversation, I find the conversation about universal basic income comes in quite often, I guess, with these technology conversations. My opinion on it is that we should never accept it, because there are other ways of getting income, for example, by making companies pay for our data. And to me, the big risk of universal basic income is an inequality risk. So ultimately saying that if you don't take your labor to industry, and you rely on outward money coming to support your life, if you're not happy with how the world evolves, how are you going to raise your voice? So unless we've got really great technology systems and blockchain comes to save us and we can all democratically vote on every decision that needs to be made, I think accepting universal basic income in return for a handful of companies being allowed to reap huge profits is something that we shouldn't be doing. But yeah, I think we might be able to all work a little bit less.
No, I was just also going to speak about the same thing, but I think, if we look back, everything's become more efficient and we're just working longer and harder hours, so I don't think that will necessarily mean more leisure time.
Well, I will respectfully disagree and say in the past 100 years, we've like halved our working hours or something. So, yeah. So people, I don't know.
Maybe I should just note, this is definitely something that has been studied by economists. So I don't know the answer, but it's been done by professionals, so there is an answer to that question.
Adding to that, I just think that before a lot of managers in the room or any people don't get excited anytime soon. I think it's still, if anything, it's still going to be something that takes quite a few years. So yesterday, being in a room with a whole lot of global heads of innovation, and the fear that all this new technology, it sounds almost immediate. It's still going to take quite a long time before the high-level operations can completely be taken over by AI, and people still need to be there to check that the outcome is correct. So I don't know if I could put a number, I don't know, like 10 years, 15 years? It's a complete thumb suck, but it's not tomorrow.
And just to qualify my comment, for instance, legal compliance auditing, that requires a person to go out into the field to test and to write the audit report and to make sure you're thorough and that you're specific and so forth. So what I did is I, together with developers, created a product with which I've cut down 3 weeks of work to maybe 12 hours of work. So, but I'm not working less, I'm just doing more audit reports. So, so it's not more leisure time for me, it's just kind of more productivity in my 14-hour day.
Okay, you clearly have worked more and more. The one final, are we going to have one more question? Yeah, cool.
Okay, so earlier in the last question, we were talking about, or you guys were talking about how we would integrate our lives with AI. And one of the things that Neil said was that it would eventually be possible to have something like a business run completely by an AI. And so my question is, how would we approach that legally? Would we treat that AI as a human CEO and give them the full rights of a human? And would we expect them to comply with our legal laws if they aren't a citizen of any particular country?
Can I quickly touch on that? Is that I think it was 2 weeks ago, the first pedestrian that was killed by an autonomous car, by an Uber, that was reported. And the Chief Marketing Officer of Renault said the reason why autonomous cars aren't like free reign is because the regulation behind what happens in that scenario hasn't been decided yet. Like right now, with the lady whose family is going to demand justice, who's at fault? Was it her? Did she not watch? Was it the car? And all of that. So I think just, you know, in addition into that was that happened recently, and we're trying to figure out still, because we're letting autonomous cars drive us, but now who's at fault? We still have to sort that out.
Yeah, so this is the big question. I think in ethics, the big question is, are AI people? And in law, the big question is, will AI be legal people? Which is very cool. So at the moment, definitely not. But I do think it's possible. So at the moment, we've got what are called natural persons, which you have to be like a human. And then you've got juristic persons. So we have companies and certain other incorporated entities recognized as juristic persons. And they don't operate on the same level as natural persons, but in a lot of respects they do. So for example, during the certification of the Constitution, our Constitutional Court said that the right to freedom of expression must be something that is afforded to a company, treated as a person. And the company has the right to freedom of expression. But something like, I suppose dignity is also there. What's an example? Like housing is not something that a company has a right to. But their reasoning was still tied to people. So they said a company must have the right to freedom of expression because people won't be able to express themselves freely if a media house doesn't have the right to freedom of expression. So it was still very much tied to humans. So, I mean, there's precedent for non-humans having legal personality. But it's usually where it's required for people to have rights. So whether or not an AI will be recognized as a legal person, I think is very much going to depend on what that link is. Either way, it's going to be very difficult to regulate, though. If something is living on, so a smart contract, for example, is something that you can't have a central entity alter because there's copies of it in tens of thousands of locations all around the world, and it will execute when the conditions are met. So the only way to get around that is to then try and find out, okay, well, who was the person who got it, and go to a real court and get them to give money back. But they are very much being built to evade the legal system. I sound that in a way that it sounds like it's terrorists doing it, but I mean, you know what I'm saying. It'll be very difficult for regulating that, but there will certainly be policies that develop in response. I don't think AI will gain legal personality anytime soon. but I think that you wouldn't be crazy to make the argument that they should. Yes, no, that was a gimmick.
Shenanigans. So something that we're going to have to grapple with is culpability. Okay, can they have intent? Can they be negligent? And where will the claim land? Because law is concerned with, if I have a claim against a person or a company, where does that land? So it actually becomes simpler once AI or systems has separate legal personality and has a patrimony, has money. Because if you want to make a claim, then you can claim, and you will get what's due to you, and that's fine. It's in the interim where we have non-human entities making decisions that can impact on people's finances or lives or rights, that have been taught to do that. So the conundrum is: do you go to who taught that system to make a decision like that, or where does it land? Because in that case, no one's going to want to develop these systems, because if it keeps on coming back to you, and for instance, you do a system that's used in banking or something like that, it'll be absolutely perilous. Just one issue and you're wiped out, and you as the developer who taught this machine to make a decision in a certain way would be wiped out financially.
Cool. I think we're going to have one final question, and then a quick question, quick answers, and then the case clinic, I believe.
Cool. So my question was actually on Sophia, that got brought up with her being declared a citizen. And I just wanted to get the panel's opinion on whether they think that we'll slowly start integrating AI into things that humans can more tangibly deal with, like interacting with a supposed human that is, built on an AI algorithm or some sort of data set, or however Sophia was built. What is your opinion on us sort of trying to put it into human form to understand it, versus just sort of seeing AI on a computer screen and being like, okay, that's the answer?
Just make a small comment. Something that I've noticed in practice. So a few of my clients have kind of purchased chatbots, okay, which are quite good. You can go on for a while without realizing it's a human, and the response, the consumer response, has actually been quite extreme. They're outraged when they find out it's not a human. So if you told them it was a chatbot, they'd be completely fine with the fact that it couldn't answer this question. But then you kind of go a little bit outside of its training, and then it can't answer your question. Then they figure out it's a chatbot, and they're completely outraged. And most of them now, beforehand they tell you, listen, you're chatting to a bot. By the way, this is not a human that you're speaking to, even though it's very natural. So I thought that was quite an interesting thing that I've seen in practice.
So I do a few chatbots as well, and a few talks on chatbots, and there's a large amount of psychology that actually goes into it, because I know you're talking about like tangible forms, but already we are very much used to chatting to our friends, and we can see them tangibly, but when they aren't there, we can chat to them in a way. And now what we're doing with an artificial assistant is we are actually projecting a whole bunch of these human-based associations into that paradigm, which is incredibly interesting. Further, the most common thing said to a chatbot is thank you. You don't need to thank a chatbot, but it's the most common thing to say to it. So these interesting emotional forms, or like physical forms that elicit emotion, are incredibly interesting as well, because they're going to change our perception a lot about what is acceptable and what is possible with AI.
Chris, before we wrap up, can we maybe get like 20 seconds to shamelessly punt the companies /UCT that we're from?
Yes.
Fantastic, I'll start. Yeah, cool, sorry. Just wanted to shout out, I mean, I am working on a legal research platform at Q Division. I do think technology has the ability to make things accessible that aren't accessible, and law is probably the least accessible things in our lives. If anyone is interested in that, like, come chat to me. Love to chat. Thanks, Chris.
Cool. So with that, I'm going to say thank you to the speakers. They have been incredible. Please join me with a round of applause. I believe Chantal has presents for them. While she's handing out the presents, there's going to be a peer-to-peer networking. And what that means is these people are going to be in different corners, eating food and drinking. And what we've done is we said if you have a question related to a certain topic, you can approach a specific person. So if you are interested in law in AI, you can talk to David. So that is, how do we anticipate AI? Applied and or general AI will be regulated, looking at concerns and trends. So talk to David for that. For AI in the African workplace, please talk to Lethabo. So she'll talk about how companies, employees fear AI as it's seen as a tool mainly to cut costs versus enable people. Then for AI in law, please talk to Neil. So how do we anticipate AI replacing or augmenting legal work jobs? And he will talk about the system that Q Division is building. And then finally, for augmented AI, please talk to Wiebke. Imagining the future of connected systems and how we own our identities in an age of AI. Finally, for miscellaneous, etc., ethics, bias, technology, other opportunities. If you want to join this panel discussion in the future, so I think this is a very important discussion to have as a community to really make sure that we're having an inclusive, integrated discussion on what AI can do, both technologically and also sociologically. And if you want to be involved, please come talk to me afterwards. Thank you so much for joining.
Our next meeting is the 19th of June.